When my girlfriend Nina and I decided to elope, we could not afford to live anywhere else but the slums. After a couple of months, we were starting to get used to the rough neighborhood somehow. We learned about the most dangerous areas, the people that we could count on, and which people we should avoid the most. The slums were hardly accessible to the police, and the real authorities on the streets were the gangs that had their own respective turfs. We were able to avoid any trouble for quite a while, but it was inevitable that we would eventually encounter the dangerous elements that surrounded us. When we went shopping in the local mart one day, things went from bad to worse pretty quickly. While we were at the mart, 2 suspicious men tried to harass Nina. I immediately stepped up and shoved one of them away from my girl, but my attempt to defend her had put us in bigger trouble when more of the thugs showed up. We ran to the parking lot and jumped on my scooter as quick as we could, but these group of hooligans chased after us with their car. We rode as fast as my motor could take us, and the thugs were laughing their asses off while deliberately remaining on our tail just to mock our efforts to get away. Nina was crying in fear as the maniacs were swinging their bats in the air like madmen. We got out of the main streets and squeezed our way through narrow alleyways where the car wouldn't be able to follow us. And just when I thought that we were able to lose them, we ran into bigger trouble. I was driving frantically when I took a blind turn out of the alley. Due to my panic, we slammed against a van parked at the side of a pub. The black van had a logo of a gang at the windshield, and the plate number was covered. For any kind of criminal groups to flaunt their insignia up front in the hood, it was clear that they were oozing with confidence. And based on what I heard, the logo belonged to one of the most prominent syndicate around the area. They were the top dogs that were in control of the illegal trades and crimes on the streets. Luck was simply not on our side during that night. We barely got away from the common thugs chasing after us, and I just damaged the vehicle of an even more dangerous group of men. A couple of guys in black suits with gold accessories all over casually walked out of the pub when they heard the collision. They slowly walked towards us while lighting a cigarette. I wanted to apologize for the accident as I was helping Nina get back up with a broken arm. I already sensed what was coming next, and so we desperately jumped back on my scooter as one of them was about to pull out a gun from his coat. He didn't even bother to fire at us. I saw him on my side mirror making a call. Few moments later, 3 men in riding motorcycles suddenly appeared. Armed with an Uzi, one of the bikers trailed some shots on the ground when I tried to turn on an alleyway again. He was even hitting some of the parked cars on the sideway, but he didn't care at all. A big man filled with tattoos and armed with a pistol rushed out of his house when he saw his car getting shot, but he immediately ran back in when he saw the insignia on the bike of the shooter. Even a seemingly capable man backed away when he recognized the group. My heart was already thumping off my chest as these men calmly toyed with us. They could easily catch up to us if they wanted. I was already having a really hard time steering because of one of my broken arms. Nina was already bawling in fear, but there was nothing I could do to calm her down. To make matters even worse, she was shot on the leg when one of the bikers were just trying to scare us and fired aimlessly. I was begging for them to spare us as we kept on going with my scooter's top speed. And when one of them finally pointed his gun on our backs, I knew that we were done for. However, the bikers were suddenly stopped on their tracks when we reached an area that we had never seen before. It appeared that I trespassed a private property since there were rails coiled with barbed wires blocking the path. But I swiveled around the blockade since we had nowhere else to go. Aside from the fact that the armed members of the most feared syndicate suddenly backed away when we arrived to this area, the property seemed strange. There were usually small groups hanging around outside and sound systems blasting off from the houses, but the area was completely silent and seemed abandoned. Homeless folks would often occupy these kinds of forsaken properties, but there wasn't a single person around. It was eerily quiet, which was quite unsettling, but at least we were able to get rid of the bikers. We decided to stay there for a while in order to make sure that the gangs and the syndicate members wouldn't be around when we leave. We went inside the abandoned building and we realized that it was some kind of a hospital. There were a number of spacious rooms with medical beds, and there were leftovers of broken test tubes and glass cylinders on the tables. There were 2 floors in the building, and the only ones with windows directed outside had a visible source of light somehow. The building was generally dark, and we could only rely on our phone so we could see where we were going. I laid Nina in one of the beds so I could tend to her wound. Luckily, there were leftover bandages in the room. It was quite unsanitary, but I had to stop the bleeding. Nina grabbed some wraps and tended to my broken arm. As I was watching her wind the bandage around me, tears just fell across my face before I even realized that I was crying. I felt so incompetent for not being able to protect her, and she was clearly traumatized by what just happened. Her hands were shaking, but she was still trying to care for me. However, the thugs and the bikers were nothing when compared to the horror that happened next. While we were resting, we heard a faint sound of shuffling footsteps coming from outside of the room. We were both spent and wounded. Nina and I were in no shape to defend ourselves if another treat would come our way. I assumed that it must be some junkie secretly staying inside the building, and so we just agreed to give him all of our money to avoid any more conflicts. We waited for someone to show up on the doorway, but then the footsteps just stopped. I cautiously stepped out, and I was surprised by what I saw. Instead of some junkie, there was an old lady peeking from the end of the hallway. She looked frail and relatively harmless, and so I waved my hand and politely asked if we could stay there for a while. The lady did not respond. She didn't even have any reaction at all. But that was until Nina also walked out of the room. Nina's blood seeped out from the bandage, and the old lady's eyes widened as her nails crackled against the wall. She started breathing heavily. I asked her what was wrong. When I was about to approach her, she suddenly howled like a rabid beast. From the shadows of the hallway, we heard countless footsteps coming forth. Right behind the old lady, where the dim light of the moon cannot reach, dozens of people came lunging forward. They were growling and shrilling like wild animals, and they were drooling for the sight of blood from Nina's wound. We couldn't really fathom what was happening, but we immediately ran back into the room and locked it. Nina began to scream as they were aggressively ramming at the door. I pushed against it to stop them from breaking the lock easily, but I was also leaning my weight on the door in order to keep on standing since my knees were buckling out of absolute terror. Unfortunately, we were still far from safe. There was a big glass window as some kind of observatory station right next to our room, and we could see their silhouettes as they were running past the gap of the open door. I feared that we had nowhere else to run if they would discover this room and break through the glass, and so I acted promptly with what little remained of my bravery. We moved one of the tables and blocked the door, and then we broke through the window to get inside the observatory room. We locked the door in there and blocked it with whatever we could find. Inside that room, there was an entryway for the exhaust system on the ceiling. We desperately climbed our way in, and it was made even harder by our injuries. The vent passed through several rooms of the floor, and we noticed that some of the screens were also popped off. After a few moments of crawling inside the very tight space, we learned why some of the vents were open. Nina held in her scream by covering her mouth with both her hands when we came across a rotting corpse of a man. It seemed that he went into this building and tried to escape the beastly mob by also crawling inside the vents, and discovering his corpse immediately drained our hopes of surviving this terrifying night. Because of what we saw, I knew that I had to think of something else so we could escape from this place. We inspected the rooms as we were passing across them, and we stopped in one of the other labs when I saw some stuff that we could use. There was an alcohol burner at the table, and we needed to stop Nina's wound from bleeding. The blood clearly attracted the ghoul-like inhabitants of this abandoned property, and I guessed that they only go with their primal instincts like a mob of mindless zombies. I used the alcohol that remained in the burner to cauterize Nina's wound. I could only imagine the pain that she had to endure, and I felt so bad for doing this to her. She tried her best to toughen up and clenched her teeth on a piece of cloth to muffle her scream as I burnt her skin, and I removed the bandage from my broken arm and wrapped it around her wound. I used my shirt to support my arm instead, and then we went on with our plan. While we were crawling inside the vents, we discovered that there was another floor underground where the mindless mob came from. Even though I was one functional arm short, I could still run faster than Nina since she was already limping with her wounded leg. I dragged the rotting corpse that we found along the way, and I wrapped Nina's blood-filled bandage around him. I dumped the body in the underground floor, and I screamed at the top of my lungs to get the mob's attention. Luckily, the plan worked just as we expected. They came running like savage maniacs, and they went inside the underground floor to feast on the corpse. I ran as fast as I could back to the lab before they arrived. We locked the door and we climbed back to the vent. We crawled as fast as we could and returned to the room where we were before. From there, we quickly stormed out of the building and jumped on the scooter. Despite of all the series of challenges that we had to face, we were able to get back home that night. When we told our closest neighbors what happened to us, they weren't as surprised as we thought they would be. We learned that the abandoned building was once a private facility that was used to experiment new drugs on humans. Apparently, something went completely wrong and they had to shut down. There were rumors that anyone who dared to enter that place never came back out, and it was generally avoided by everyone since then. We were the first ones to escape and tell the tale of what lurks in the shadows of the abandoned laboratory. After a few years, we were able to move out from the slums and found a better place to live. However, we would never forget the incomparable horror that we experienced that night.